tilt the other way. Yeah. Okay, now move the camera up a little bit, the front of it up. No, just pull on the thing, yeah. Just push down on it. A little more. Okay, that's good, right there. Jaya Radha Madhava Kunja Bihari Gopi Janaballabha Giri Baradari Yasoda Nandana Brajajana Ranjana Yamuna Tira Banachari Jai Radha Madhava Kunja Bihari Hare Krishna Hare Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama Hare Rama 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 Hare 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 Krishna, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. Jaya Prabhupada, Prabhupada Jaya, Prabhupada Jaya, Prabhupada. Prabhupada, 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 Jaya Prabhupada. Jayom Vishnupad Paramahamsa Paramahansa To Tadasata Shri Shri Mad Divine Grace A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada Ki Ananta Koti Vaishnava Vrinda Ki Grantaraj Srimad Bhagavatam Ki Samveda Bhakta Vrinda Ki Gaur Premanandi. All glories to some devotees. All glories to some devotees. All glories to some devotees. All glories to Sri Sri Guru and Sri Gauranga. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Ajnanatimirandasya Gananjana Shalakhaya Chakshur Unmilitam Yena Tasmai Shri Guruve Namaha Shri Chaitanya Manobishtam Shtapitam Yena Bhutale Swayam Rupaka Damayam Dadati Swapadantikam Vandehang Shri Guru Shri Yuta Padakamalam Shri Gurun Vaishnavam Cha Shri Rupam Sagrajatam Sahagana Raghunathanvitam Tam Sajivam Sadvaitam Savadhunam Parijana Sahitam Krishna Chaitanya Devam Shri Radha Krishna Padan Sahagana Lalita Shri Vishakhanvitamscha He Krishna Karuna Sindho Dina Bandho Jagatpate Gopesha Gopika Kanta Radha Kanta Namostute Tapta Kanchana Gaurangi Radhe Vrindavan Eshvari Vrishabhanu Sute Devi Pranamami Hari Priye Vanchakalpatarubhyascha Kripa Sindhubhya Evacha Patitanam Pavanebhyo Vaishnavebhyo Namo Namaha Shri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Shri Advaita Gadadhara Shri Vasadi Gaur Bhakta Vrinda Hare Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare 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 Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama Rama Hare Hare. Okay. Canto 3, Chapter 15, Text 17. Vaimanika salalanas chatirani sashvad. Vaimanika chalalanas chatirani sashvad. Gayanti yatra shamala kshapanani bhartu. What's that? Yeah, I know. You did it yesterday. Yeah, I know. The whole thing is that there's days and the verses are assigned. You jumped ahead one, so I don't know what to do. Otherwise, we throw the entire thing off. Each person has a day, and each person has a verse assigned to them, and it's up there on the board for a month in advance. So, war is hell. Yeah. So, we get a chance. I'll talk about all kinds of other stuff. Gayanti yatra shamalakshapanani bhartu antarjalenu vakasan madhu madhavinam antarjalenu vikasan madhu madhavinam Gandhena kandita diyo piyanilam kshipanta Gandhena kandita diyo piyanilam kshipanta Vaimanika chalalanas chadirani sashvad Gayanti yatra shamalakshapanani bhartu Antarjalenu vikasan madhu avinam Kandena kandita diyo piyanilam kshipanta Vaimanika chalalanas charitani shashvad Gayanti yatra shamalakshapanani bhartu Antarjalenu vikasan madhu madhavinam Gandhena kandita diyo piyanilam kshipanta Vaimanika chalalanas charitani bashvad Gayanti yatra shamalakshapanani bhartu Antarjalenu vikasan madhu madhavinam Gandhena kandita diyopyanilam kshipanta Vaimanika chalalanas charitani shashvad Gayanti yatra shamalakshapanani bhartu Antarjalenu vikasan madhu madhavinam Gandhena kandita diyopi anilam kshipanta Vaimanika flying in their airplanes Salalana along with their wives Charitani activities Shashvat eternally Gayanti sing Yatra in those Vaikuntha planets Shamala all inauspicious qualities Kshapanani devoid of Bhartuhu of the Supreme Lord. Andha Jale, in the midst of the water. Anuvikasat, blossoming. Madhu, fragrant, laden with honey. Madhavinam, of the Madhavi flowers. Gandhena, by the fragrance. Kandita, disturbed. Diha, minds. Api, even though. Anilam, breeze. Kshipantaha, deriding. So the translation reads as follows. In the Vaikuntha planets, the inhabitants fly in their airplanes, accompanied by their wives and consorts, and eternally sing of the character and activities of the Lord, which are always devoid of all inauspicious qualities. While singing the glories of the Lord, they deride even the presence of the blossoming Madhavi flowers, which are fragrant and laden with honey. So, responsively, in the Vaikuntha planets, the inhabitants fly in their airplanes, accompanied by their wives and consorts, and eternally sing of the character and activities of the Lord, which are always devoid of all inauspicious qualities. While singing the glories of the Lord, they deride even the presence of the blossoming Madhavi flowers, which are fragrant and laden with honey. So here is Prabhupada's purport. It appears from this verse that the Vaikuntha planets are full of all opulences. They are airplanes in which the inhabitants travel in the spiritual sky with their sweethearts. There is a breeze carrying the fragrance of blossoming flowers, and this breeze is so nice that it carries the honey of the flowers. The inhabitants of Vaikuntha, however, are so interested in glorifying the Lord that they do not like the disturbance of such a nice breeze while they are chanting the Lord's glories. In other words, they are pure devotees. They consider glorification of the Lord more important than their own sense gratification. In the Vaikuntha planets, there is no question of sense gratification. To smell the fragrance of a blossoming flower is certainly very nice, but it is simply for sense gratification. The inhabitants of Vaikuntha give first preference to the service of the Lord, not their own sense gratification. Serving the Lord in transcendental love yields such transcendental pleasure that, in comparison, sense gratification is counted as insignificant. Vaimani kacha lalanas charitani sashvad gayanti yatra shamalakshapanani bhartuhu antarjalenu vikasadu madavinam gandhena kandita dio pyanilam kshipanta. In the Vaikuntha planets, the inhabitants fly in their airplanes, accompanied by their wives and consorts, and eternally sing of the character and activities of the Lord, which are always devoid of all inauspicious qualities. While singing the glories of the Lord, they deride even the presence of the blossoming Madhavi flowers, which are fragrant and laden with honey. So, this verse we are continuing about hearing about the spiritual world. The spiritual sky is known in Sanskrit as Paravyoma. And there are many luminous planets, and these planets are self-luminous, so they are not illuminated by a sun as such. In fact, in the spiritual sky, everything is self-luminous. One time Prabhupada described it as kind of like neon sign. You know, the neon sign doesn't need to be illuminated by some external light source. It has its own light. So there's a couple of things, you know, actually when you start thinking about it, we're comparing two very different realms. The realm of the material world and the realm of the spiritual world. And it's interesting, some of the things that have been described here. And this idea of more than one world is something that goes way back in philosophy. The Greeks had some idea that there might be some other kind of world. Of course, they thought of it not as the spiritual world the way we think of the spiritual world. They thought of some world of perfect things. Along with, starting with Pythagoras, you know, there was this idea that numbers were somehow perfect, and that numbers don't get old, they don't decay, they don't get created at any time, they're always the same. So there was this sense that somewhere there must be a world like this, a world where things don't change, where nothing ever decays. Of course, this whole idea of just a mathematical world of numbers is not very palatable. I mean, you can't get very far with that. And actually, during Pythagoras' time, Pythagoras actually was part of a spiritual community. And he taught various things that were considered very strange to the Greeks at the time. He taught that there's something called reincarnation, where people are born again and again, that people should not eat meat, that people should refrain from a lavish sexual indulgence. I mean, maybe you've heard ideas like this, and they are kind of crazy ideas, right? So we start to hear that the more we learn about some of these groups way back, there must have been some kind of influence, you know, either from India or because when two people are studying the same thing, they come up, generally speaking, to the same conclusion because they're studying within the same universe. So, at any rate. So, where there's such things as platonic solids, these ideas of certain geometric solid shapes that at least some Greeks associated with the elements, earth, water, fire, and air. So they had a cube associated with one, a dodecahedron associated with another one. So these things were considered to be perfect. And so there seemed to be some kind of perfect world, a world that everyone intuitively knows, but we don't actually see it. There was an argument in early philosophy in the Greek and Roman period about where are what we call universals. We talk about a triangle, but we never see an actual triangle. What we see is a representation of a triangle. Any triangle you draw on a piece of paper is not perfectly straight, and it has a line that defines it, and that line has a thickness, whereas actual triangles don't. So there's an ideal and what we actually see. And when the Greeks talked about philosophy, often they talked about the ideal human being, which also we don't see in the world, generally speaking. We don't see an ideal human being. So if we don't see one, where does this idea come from? So this was actually an interesting rabbit hole that you can philosophically dive down. If we have a concept of a perfect human being, or we have a concept of a perfect triangle, then where must these ideas be if we don't see them in the world around us? They must be somewhere else, in another world. And so there was this idea of an ideal world somewhere. Of course, again, this is not at all like what we understand as the spiritual world, which is full of form and variety, replete. It's way more than just numbers or ideal versions of things we have in this world. And actually, in modern thinking, we have this idea of where do the things, the words we have for, even come from? We have words for things, and these words are different in different languages. You know, in one language, a word might be something. In another language, it's something else. You know, soul is a word for sun in Spanish and Italian. It's słońce in Polish. It's in Chinese. And there's a whole bunch of different things, but the word and the concept, we know what it is. So how does a child even learn these concepts when it's growing up? I mean, it's not that the mother and father takes the child around and says, there is a cat. There is a pot holder. There is a bottle. There is a kitchen sink. There is a floor. You know, nobody learns languages like that. I mean, certainly sometimes a child will point to something and say, what is that? And someone will explain the name for that thing. But somehow our other children absorb these things. And not only that, we have these concepts. Where do they come from? And the answer, of course, is they come from the spiritual world originally. So in the spiritual world, everything does exist in an ideal form. Everyone, as we hear, every step is a dance, every word is a song, every day is a festival. So this is what the spiritual world is like. In the material world, we can see by sharp contrast that things are not like that. The spiritual world is Sat, Chit, Ananda. The material world is Asat, Achit, and Nirananda. Everything in the material world is Asat, means it's not permanent. It's Achit, which means it's not what it appears to be oftentimes. And Nirananda, everything, a lot of things in the material world are miserable. So it's the opposite of Sat, Chit, and Ananda. So in the spiritual world, everyone's happily serving the Supreme Lord. And they live in an ideal setting. There's no need for any real government per se. There's no need for anyone to do austerities or to go to work every morning. There's no need for parking tickets or lines drawn on Skimmerhorn so that the bicycle people know where they're supposed to be and everybody else knows where they're supposed to be. There's no need for any of these things. And the stage of the spiritual world is whatever it needs to be. It's organized by Yogamaya. Yogamaya is Krishna's potency for, it's like in a traveling theater or something like that. It's the grip and the stage hands and the lighting and all that kind of thing. That's what Yoga Maya does. She creates the right season. She creates the right mood. She creates the right ambience. And, we're hearing here in Vaikuntha, everything is attractive. There's flowers everywhere. I've always thought about this, that, when you come into a temple, people can say, well, these Hare Krishna people, they're all crazy guys, and girls, what do they know, But if you come into a temple, you'll hear nice music, you'll see flowers, there's nice food to eat. But what do most people do? Like on the weekend, they go to bars and things like that. In bars, things are dark. There's places where people have thrown up on the floor. It stinks in there. There's a smell of cigarette tobacco and alcohol. And there is nasty human interactions going on because people are trying to become, to hook up with one another. So they're engaging with each other in really ugly ways. So there's nothing attractive about it. It's sort of an affront to the senses. But the only reason people can deal with it is you've got usually significant amount of alcohol in you, so that you don't even notice all that stuff. You're just inebriated and you just go through with it. And you get together, some unfortunate stuff happens, and then you wake up the next morning half remembering what took place and wondering all these kind of things, And so something right there says that spiritual life is a life where there's harmony between people. It's a life where there's color. It's not a dead place. It's not a place where there's only numbers or dodecahedrons and perfect squares and perfect cubes or whatever it is. It's not a place where all the archetypes of universal concepts like tableness, like catness, like floorness or skyness exist. It's a place where there are people doing things. And the Supreme Lord is there, as we're hearing that the Supreme Lord is there. And the residents, they fly in their airplanes. And these airplanes, they don't need frequent flyer miles. They don't have to go through PSA. There's no terrorists. Instead, these vehicles are propelled by what we would say is some kind of magical, way of doing things. Now, here's a point that I really want to make, that I kind of see the spiritual world and the material world kind of like an hourglass. On the top, there's the spiritual world, where it has all this spiritual variety and form and activity going on. And then it slenders down to a small middle part, and then it expands out again in the bottom. The idea of the 15th chapter of the Bhagavad Gita, the banyan tree, that we have a tree up above, and then we have a tree that's upside down below. So in the middle, it narrows, and that's where the Brahman is, the white light. There's nothing there. Now, many philosophers actually see this white light as being something very, very important. And this is why Prabhupada, and he mentions this in several of the purports, that the impersonalists think that this merging in the white light is somehow the perfection. But if I told you that next room over, there's a machine there, and if you go in that machine, you will be depersonalized completely. and you will merge in the all one. Now, and you could actually see somebody going in there and they disappear when they go in the machine. How many people would volunteer to go into that machine? You know, there's just something suspicious about merging with the one. And the reason it's suspicious is it's so completely different from everything we know. We are humans. We have relationships with other humans. And those relationships take time, and there are various rasas or emotions that are exchanged. Now, the Brahman, no emotions, no relationships, ain't nothing happening there. It's just white. There's no you. There's nothing you see. It's not changing. Next Thursday, it's not going to be different. It's no reason for any schedules because nothing is going on there. So how attractive is that? You know, it's not exactly that attractive. And why is it not attractive? It's not attractive because there's no form and variety. So if somewhere platonically there's a world, a frozen world, or a world of just the Brahman, there's nothing really attractive about it. Time exists. Krishna is time, as he says in Bhagavad Gita. Kalosmi Bharatarshava. So Krishna is time, and so everything happens in time. Even pastimes take time to happen. So in the spiritual world, there's time. In the material world, there's time. In the spiritual world, there's a different kind of time. In the material world, there's destructive time, where something comes to an end. And this is what bothers us, because in the material world, we have such a thing as things coming to an end. They never happen again, you know. Queen Elizabeth II is no more as of a week ago or whatever it was, you know. So she was walking around Buckingham Palace with her corgis, and now she's in a box, and people are coming to pay respects. So the soul is going on, but she will never again be Queen Elizabeth II in that body. That will never happen again. She's on to a new life, whatever it was. In our Sabha conference or another, that became a real topic. I don't know why, but at any rate, I'm not going to talk about it. Any rate, whatever she became or will become is another story. But any rate, that's the nature of the material world. That things are, and then they stop being forever. You know, Dwight D. Eisenhower is never going to come back to life. We're never going to see the, signing of the Constitution again. You know, it happened way before. So things happen once, and then that's it. They never happen again in the same way with the same people. But in the spiritual world, no one is born, no one dies. Everything goes on forever. And sometimes there is repetition of pastimes. Not exact, identical repetition, but there's repetition. And of course, since everybody is cued into the Supreme Lord, in the wanting to please the Supreme Lord, naturally there's harmony. And as we're hearing in today's verse, that sense gratification is exactly the center of the material world. That's what everybody does, what everybody wants, what everybody plans for, and what our lives orbit. In the spiritual world, it's not like that. The spiritual world, people are planning to please the Supreme Lord, and they're figuring out how to do that. And they are naturally satisfied. It's not like they're worried, do they get enough vitamin D? You know, they're not worried, are they going to get enough roughage in the day's worth of things that they eat. None of these things are issues for people in the spiritual world, nor are they worried that they're not going to be able to make the mortgage payments. So that's why we call it Vaikunta. Kunta means suffering or anxiety, and Vai means not. There's none of that there. So the spiritual world is absent of any serious anxiety, at least material anxiety. Material anxiety comes from the fact that maybe I won't get my material desires satisfied. That's the big fear in the material world. Maybe I won't get my material desires satisfied. Now, if you're not even worried about material desires, that becomes a non-issue in the spiritual world. In fact, you're focused on the Supreme Lord, and that is fully engaging. And it's not just a temporary thing. It's not like everybody files into a big room, they sing some hymn, and then there's coffee and donuts afterwards. You know, it's not like that, you know. The spiritual world is interactions. There are things going on. Sometimes there is a tussle. Sometimes there is what appears to be some kind of disharmony, but it's not really disharmony in the larger picture, and nothing really drastic or untoward happens. Rather, sometimes devotees have different impressions on how to please the Supreme Lord, and therefore there is some, you know, thing happening. And of course, in the spiritual world, things can happen whatever way they need to happen. In the material world, our world is made up of, at least in our modern thinking, we see the material world is made up of atoms. And those atoms have more or less nothing more than mathematical properties. And so if you study quantum physics or physics in general at a small stage, at a small state, you'll see that basically atoms and electrons, they just have mathematical properties. Used to be, we thought of atoms as little billiard balls or ping pong balls or something like that on a very small scale. Nobody thinks that way anymore. Of course, when they teach it in colleges and high schools, they still talk like that. But everybody knows that this is, as they call it, stories we tell children, you know, that what they really think atoms are now is much weirder than that, you know. So, any rate, the point that I'm making here is that they behave in a very structured way. You've got, you know, the Schrodinger wave equation, and an atom will come together with another atom in a very specific way according to their valence shells and all these kind of things. So some kind of things come together and other kinds of things don't come together. And if you want to do something in the material world, it takes a specific sequence of things that must happen before the thing is able to take place. And that's because this is the restriction on people in the material world. You can't enjoy in a simple way. If you want to enjoy material life, you have to do all sorts of complex activities. And usually, you just hope at the end of all these complex activities, you'll find enjoyment, but sometimes it doesn't work that way. So everything in the material world works in a specific way. That's exactly what the physicists and the chemists and the other scientists are studying, those restrictions. In the spiritual world, there are no atoms. Everything is made of the energy of the Supreme. It can do whatever it needs to do in whatever way it needs to do it, and we don't need to make a machine to make it happen. If it's part of the situation, then Yoga Maya arranges for it to take place in some kind of way. It's always pleasant to the senses, and there's no scarcity of anything. They don't have to go digging in the earth for something, or sending off on back order to some factory to distribute something. Everything is as is needed. Now, of course, as I was mentioning the other day in a Sunday class, that Krishna's pastime, since Krishna is the Supreme Lord, he could do anything in any kind of way. He doesn't need anything from anybody. If somebody brings him some food, it's not like Krishna's going to starve if he doesn't get that food. If somebody makes a garland for him, he could make zillions of garlands in just a second if he wanted to. So he doesn't need anything. And actually, he has everything already. So why doesn't he be happy as a Brahman effulgence of white light? And the answer, of course, is because he wants pastimes, which require time, and it requires people, and it requires relationships. And since he could do anything in any kind of way, he doesn't really even need. We're going to read in a little while a couple of verses from today's verse, that the ladies in Vaikuntha dust the marble floors and walls, even though there's no dust. There's almost no dust, they say. So these things are actually gestures. It's a whole world that is based on gestures. And through gestures, the love between the Supreme Lord and his devotee, and the devotee and the Supreme Lord is brokered. So that can happen through gestures with whatever props or paraphernalia are necessary in the spiritual world, and this is constantly going on. And so if suddenly we need 1,000,000 gopis, they're there. If we're in a house, the house can expand if it needs to encompass more gopis or cowherd boys or whatever the situation is. We don't need carpenters. We don't need to artificially manufacture something. That's the way it happens in the material world, because we're under all these material restrictions, where if you have 10 people, they can fit in a room, but if you have 200 people, they might not be able to fit in that same room. So the spiritual world doesn't have to play by those rules. The spiritual world does not depend on the rules of physics. But at the same time, Krishna creates obstacles so that the devotees have a reason to do something for him. So sometimes Krishna and Radha become estranged from one another. There is some rift between them, and some devotees try to get them together again. We were talking about a pastime like that not so long ago, a few days ago. And so even though there's nothing that can stop Krishna from doing anything, still he creates issues and obstacles, and those are part of the pastime, and they make the pastime relishable. Because otherwise, if everything was immediately able to be gotten or done, then where would be the interest in the pastime? So in the end, it's all Krishna and the gopis and his other devotees having a relationship with one another. And when they do, when they have their relationship, Krishna appears to them as if he's just an ordinary person, but a very attractive ordinary person. And similarly, Krishna treats all his devotees as if they were just equals to him. In fact, they're not. This is another kind of illusion, but this is a different kind of illusion than the illusion we're under here in the material world. And so this is the spiritual world, not just a white light. It's not just a world of mathematics or ideal forms. It's actually the original real world where the real stuff is happening. Krishna and his pastimes with his devotees. Here is where the also-rans, the people who chose plan B, the funky plan. This is where the material world is. This is where we are. We came here. We decided to opt out of that plan. We're here. Now, some of us have discovered we want to go back, and so we are. All right. So I'm going to break off at that point and see if there are any questions or comments in the last few minutes here. And if so, we'll discuss. Otherwise, we will move on. It's interesting the things that have been described here in this section of Bhagavatam. Actually, this is a very complex chapter. It's got 6 sections, no less. You know, from 1 to 10, we heard about the darkness occluding the universe. Then from 11 to 22. This is a section we're in right now, which is the 4 Kumaras go to Vaikuntha Loka. Then from 23 to 25, Brahma will glorify the Vaikuntha. Actually, what he's doing is he's glorifying the material earth plane because everybody who goes there can have a chance to get out. And then 26 through 37 is where we find Jayan Vijay getting cursed by the 4 Kumaras because 4 Kumaras are obstructed from going to Vaikuntha. Then from 38 through 45, that section in this particular chapter is about the Lord coming after Jayan Vijay get cursed by the 4 Kumaras. And then finally from 46 through 50, the concluding little section is where the 4 Kumaras offer prayers to Narayan. So that's how this chapter breaks down. And we've heard all this stuff about the Vaikuntha planets, you know, that there's no anxiety there. It's Vaikuntha. The material planets all worship the spiritual sky, the Vaikuntha planets. There's no desire for sense gratification. The Supreme Lord is there, and he's known by the Vedas. There in the spiritual world, the Vaikuntha worlds, there's only uncontaminated goodness. There's no mixture or admixture of rajas, tamas, or sattva. There are forests, we hear. Everything is personal there. The residents and their wives fly around in airships. When the bee speaks, all the other birds and everything become quiet because he's glorifying the Supreme Lord. And these airships that they fly around in are made of lapis lazuli, which is actually a blue stone that's found in Afghanistan, evidently, in quantity. And it's a semi-precious jewel. So again, we see that in the spiritual world, everything is beautiful and it's made of exquisite ingredients, you know, whereas in the material world, mostly things are made of plastic. Actually, That reminds me of a story that Narayan Swami told one time, that he was in India and he wanted to buy a lota. So he went into, Loy Bazaar, wherever it was. He was going to buy a lota. So he saw lotus on the, shopkeeper's shelf there. And he said, oh, I'd like that lota. He pointed at a brass one. And the shopkeeper said, why do you want that one? And he pulled out a bright green plastic lota. And he said, this is the best lota. And Badri Narayan looked at him and said, why would I want a plastic green lota like this when I could have a brass metal one? And the shopkeeper looked at him and said in all sincerity, because it's plastic, like America. So I thought that was really appropriate in one sense, that, some people think artificial is somehow better. And so this particular shopkeeper thought like this. At any rate, unless there's a final question, we can cap it off now. And I thank you all for your kind attention. All glories to Srimad Bhagavatam. You had a question? Yeah. What's that? Well, you can ask it, and anyone who wants to zap off to Prasadam. Right. That's the perennial question. And there's been great debates over it. Prabhupada gives a couple of stories. There's the Puffy story, and then there's the story of the horror film, There's the horror film story and the Puffy story. The horror film story is that Prabhupada was riding in a car, and he saw some movie like Dracula or something like that, and he said, well, why do people go see a movie like this? It's horrible, but there's an attraction, right? So that's one explanation. The other one is that Prabhupada said that of course, what are puffies? Puffies are, rice that are, we call them puffed rice. You take this metal canister. It's in India. You'll see puffy makers, and they put the rice in the metal rotating canister, and it spins around while it's being heated up. And then they pop the valve, and suddenly, boom, and immediately with the pressure being released like that, the kernels of rice, they explode to what we know as puffed rice. And I've always noticed that in India, the puffy wallas, the people who make the puffies, are always aware when there's a child around, and the child is not paying attention, so that they can get the maximum, trauma to the child when the thing goes off and it sounds like a gun, And so, at any rate, puffies have not much flavor. Everybody knows that puffed rice, it's not bad, but it's certainly not a big flavor. So Prabhupada said that people in the material world are like people who want to taste puffies. That there's rasgulla and halava and wonderful subjis and things like that. But someone says, well, I would like to see what puffies are like. Of course, that's another analogy that he used, But in essence, what we're saying here is that there is something called causeless unwillingness to serve in the spiritual world. If there wasn't such a thing as free will, everybody in the spiritual world would be robots. Robots. So if we were all robots, then what would be the meaning of being there in the spiritual world? If you had a computer and you program it to say, I love you, I love you, I love you. You could even program it to say it at some kind of ridiculous speed, you know. But even though the computer is saying I love you millions of times, somehow you doubt that the computer actually loves you, you know. So if there was not free will, then there would be no meaning to love. And so in the spiritual world, if there is no free will, then everybody there is essentially a robot. And if we're not robots, then that means there must be some way to exercise that free will. And so, as it's usually described, there's what's called causeless unwillingness to serve. We see Krishna and think, why does it always have to be Krishna? Can't I be sometimes? And of course, ding, we pop out into the material world as Brahma. So we are still serving Krishna because Brahma still serves Krishna. He's one of the main demigods. However, now in the material world, we have our own entourage, and people are also serving us. So it's not like we pop out of the material world and go right away into the dung heap, you know. But the idea is that there's no reason Krishna forces us out of the spiritual world. There's certainly no temptations in the spiritual world to come to the material world. And it's not like it happens by accident. It's a volitional act, but it's a volitional act of intent, of wanting to be like the Supreme in the sense of being the center. And the minute we do that, we come to the material world. And of course, we come in a very mode of goodness way as Lord Brahma. But eventually, usually, most of us don't go back from Lord Brahma. Instead, we get further on into the material world. We wind up in Brooklyn or somewhere like that, you know. All right, so we are about 7 minutes over. Thank you again for your kind attention. All glories to Srimad Bhagavatam, all glories to Vaishnava devotees of the Lord. Hare Krishna.